Good afternoon. It is the greatest pleasure and privilege to be here at Cliveden. This weekend, we are really extending our 100 years of cultural commitment at Chanel by partnering with this extraordinary literary festival. At the heart of our work in arts and culture, it's really about the freedom of creation and empowering women. And that's why I'm particularly thrilled to be here today with Elif Shafak, who is, of course, one of the most acclaimed and outspoken novelists today. Now, since Elif was last here, she has been shortlisted for both the Booker and the RSL Ondaatje prizes for 10 minutes and 38 seconds in this strange world. And most recently, she published in August her latest, we can discuss later if it's her best, of course, of 12, The Island of Missing Trees, a Sunday Times bestseller. Now, part narrated by a fig tree, which we'll be coming to later, it has also been described by The Guardian as a beautiful novel and by David Mitchell as a balm for our bruised times. Of course, as you will know, Elif is a Turkish-British academic and thinker who truly speaks to everyone in the 55 languages in which she has been translated. Hanif Qureshi calls her one of the best writers in the world, and before Elif starts blushing, I just want to say that she is a dauntingly prolific writer of nonfiction as well as fiction, a compelling voice for women's rights and the importance of common humanity over political division. It is my pleasure to talk to Elif about her enchanting and eclectic career at a time when her compassionate voice is really more welcome than ever. So Elif, I would love to start at the beginning, to ask you about your own roots and whether you wrote as a child. Was this always your path, your passion?
Thank you so much. Thank you, first of all, for your generous words. And I'm excited to share this platform together and very happy to be here. I have been writing since my early childhood, but that's not because I wanted to become a novelist someday. I didn't know such a thing was possible. There were no writers around me, no such role models. I think I started writing fiction so early in life because I thought life was very boring. Primarily, I was raised by a single mother, a single working mother who was away, for long hours, and partly by a traditional grandmother. So I was raised by two women, and it was in that sense a bit unusual, my upbringing, because I was born in France, then my parents got separated, and I was brought to Turkey by my mother. My father stayed in France. So there was a displacement from an early age onwards. And as I said, life was so boring. I felt the need to go into another space in my mind. And to me, Storyland was much more colorful, was much more real. And as much as I could, I wanted to stay in that zone. That's how everything started, with little diaries. But normally in a diary, you would write what happened in that particular day. I thought I had nothing interesting to write about me or about my day. It was much more interesting to me to dream or to imagine what would it be like if I were someone else and then someone else. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because for me, literature has not been necessarily autobiographical. I do understand that writers project their own feelings, their own thoughts into their work, but it doesn't have to be necessarily autobiographical. What I like about literature is that transcendental experience. If you can travel beyond the borders of the self that's given to us by birth, that's what I'm interested in, and that's how everything evolved.
It's so interesting. I've heard you speak about identity politics and the idea of not writing about what you know, but about what you feel. Yeah. And I think that's a question as well. Was there a particular moment that inspired you to write?
Mm-hmm. With fiction, I think there was a continuity, but finding the novel as a genre, that's where I felt most at home. I'm not a very patient person, which, when you are a novelist, you have to be more patient. So it brought out something else that I was lacking in my daily life. But I believe the primary reason why I feel so passionate about writing is because I feel free when I'm in the midst of a novel. I also feel like I can be multiple. We all contain multitudes, like Walt Whitman used to say so beautifully. But the trouble is we're living in an age that never allows us to celebrate our own multiplicity, to bring out our own pluralism. Whereas when you are in the world of fiction, you can be multiple. You can connect with diversity both outside of you, without, but also within. And that's my definition of freedom.
I love the way you mentioned Walt Whitman and
Yeah.
being a Russian literature major. I've
Yeah.
often been so impressed to hear you reference Chekhov and Dostoevsky with the same fluidity as Rumi and Baldwin. Was there a particular book that truly inspired you to become the writer or the person that you are?
You know, there wasn't a particular book, but I think that reading itself, but by that I mean having very eclectic reading lists. Let us read both fiction and non-fiction. And if I may add this, you know, sometimes when readers, and it's usually male readers who do this, you know, they come and they say, so much is happening in the world, I want to understand, I want to follow the world. So I read politics, I read finance, I read about neuroscience, technology, philosophy, history, but I don't read fiction, I don't have time for fiction. My wife reads fiction. And when I hear that, I really feel sad, because inside fiction, first of all, there's everything. There is history, there is politics, there is philosophy, technology, there is neuroscience. But I think more importantly, there's emotional intelligence. And I don't know a single human being in this world who doesn't need emotional intelligence. Whether we're dentists, engineers, students, teachers, we all need to connect with our own emotions. How do we turn that into something more positive, you know? What kind of a force is the power of emotions? So it's a question that is relevant for every human being. But I guess what I'm trying to say primarily is let's read across the board, both fiction and non-fiction, from East and West. You know, I don't want to stay in one comfort zone and read only the same type of books over and over, but to be curious. And also to realize that there's so much we don't know in this world. I mean, when was the last time we ever said, I don't know? We don't say I don't know anymore. You can ask me anything. If I don't know the answer, I will Google it. And in the next 5 minutes, I'll be able to say a few words to you, giving me the illusion that I know something about the subject. But in fact, I know nothing about the subject. So that's the thing that we have lost. And I think when you read books in a more multidisciplinary way, we also face our own ignorance. And that gives a different humility to the mind and the soul. I'm a big believer in interdisciplinary conversations.
I love the way you referenced reading widely and wildly, in a sense, and also challenging so many preconceptions. When we talk about gender, we've heard from our mutual friend the idea of the ubermachismo, sometimes of the Turkish culture.
Yeah.
And growing up in such a female-dominant environment, I believe your grandmother stayed home to enable your mother to go back to university. Did that shape your destiny?
Absolutely. I think it shaped me in so many ways. I mean, my grandmother was not a well-educated woman because she had been denied a proper education for being born a girl. And yet she was a big believer in women's education and women's independence. So just to give you a bit of background, my mom, you know, thinking that love was enough, love was all she needed, when she fell in love and decided to get married, she quit university. She dropped out of university, thinking she wouldn't need a diploma. And when her marriage failed, she came back with me. She had no diploma, no career, no money, nothing to fall back on. And usually women in such positions, young divorcees in such positions, in a country like Turkey, are immediately married off, usually to someone older, because you're not that favorable in the marital market anymore. And this is what the neighbors were doing, you know, intervening and finding a suitable husband, because a young woman is regarded as a danger to the society. It was my grandmother who intervened and said, no, she should go back to college, she should graduate, she should have a career, she can always get married again, but then it will be a choice, it won't be an obligation. And then until she is ready, I will take care of my granddaughter. So that's what she did. These two women, off my mother went, and I stayed with my grandmother. And the reason why I'm mentioning is because the kind of solidarity or sisterhood or whatever we call it, I think if women can empower each other, especially at such critical moments of our lives, the impact of that kind of empowerment goes beyond generations. So what my grandmother did changed my mother's life. Eventually, she got graduated with a very high average. She learned 6 languages. She became a diplomat, and our life changed completely. But it was at that critical moment that my grandmother intervened. Had she not done that, it would have been a completely different story. So there has to be sisterhood, there has to be solidarity among women. It means nothing to me if we have a few successful women in media, a few successful women in business. That means nothing if we also, pull each other up, empower each other, and realize that we're all in this together. So that kind of connections and sisterhood is something that has stayed with me for a long time.
I was so thrilled to see your daughters today because I remember the talk where you said that your grandmother, who was so mired in her mysticism and tradition, because she loved God, you ended up getting pregnant. And so many of these beautiful parables and narratives from that Turkish tradition come into your work. But yet you write so fluidly in English and in Turkish. I'd love to hear, when was that idea of moving from the Turkish to the English? Is that something that oscillates? And also between the fiction and non-fiction, how do you stay so consistent and also so malleable in terms of the narratives, the languages in which you choose to create?
I really appreciate your words. At the same time, as you can hear, I'm an immigrant in this language, so my English is full of flaws, Like every immigrant, there's a gap between my mind and my tongue. And my mind runs faster. I think as immigrants, our minds always run faster than our tongues. And our tongues try to catch up, but fail to do so. And you're always aware of that gap. As immigrants, we always want to be able to say more, maybe crack better jokes, but there's something that prevents you. That can be daunting. It can also be inspiring. I did not grow up in a bilingual house. For me, English is an acquired language, and I started learning it around the time I was 10, 11, in Spain, actually. At the time, Spanish was my second language. English became my third, but English never abandoned me, and I think I felt, again, a sense of freedom when I started reading in English, thinking in English. Being Turkish is heavy. Being a Turkish writer is heavier, and being a woman writer in Turkey is even heavier. And I think I needed an additional zone of existence. I needed that commute between English and Turkish. I'm not claiming that it's easy for me to write in English. However, I realized over the years, if my writing, I think I feel very connected to the Turkish language in a very emotional way, and to the English language in a more cerebral way. But if my writing has melancholy, sorrow, longing, I find these things much easier to express in Turkish. Whereas when it comes to humor, which I adore, or irony, or satire, I find these things much easier in English. And maybe that's a cultural difference more than a linguistic difference. But what I'm trying to say is, sometimes nationalists, because for them it's always either or, that mentality. So there were people in Turkey who got upset at me when I started writing in English. They said, she can't be called a Turkish writer anymore. What kind of a writer would abandon their mother tongue? I'm not abandoning anything. I think if we can dream in more than one language, we can write fiction in more than one language. It doesn't have to be an either-or choice.
You touch on that, and of course this idea of upsetting the Turks has also come out in your insulting of Turkishness. Maybe for a moment we just go down to that moment, and of course you've been acquitted now 15 years, but we'd love to hear how that journey has evolved.
Yes, I mean it was surreal in some ways. Unsettling too. What we're talking about is one of my earlier novels, which is called The Bastard of Istanbul. And this is a story that talks about an Armenian-American family and a Turkish family. It talks about memory and amnesia. Of course, in Turkey, we have a very long and rich history, but rich history doesn't mean strong memory. I think it's quite the opposite. We're a society of collective amnesia. And the easiest thing to do in Turkey is to forget. Our entire relationship is full of ruptures, with the past. So there's a big void, and that void is usually filled in by ultra-nationalist interpretations of the past or Islamist interpretations of the past, which say we were always a mighty empire, always talk about this golden era. But of course, as a storyteller, the story changes depending on who is telling the story. Most of the history that we know is his story. Where were the women? Where were the minorities? How did they experience? So these are questions that I care about. My book talks about memory and amnesia. It also talks about Armenian genocide, which is a big taboo in Turkey to this day. And when the book was published, I was prosecuted under Article 301. In our constitution, we have an article which protects Turkishness against insults, though nobody knows what exactly that means. So it's very open to interpretation. And this article was used against scholars, journalists, but never before against a work of fiction. And that's where things began to take a more surreal nature, because the words of Armenian fictional characters in the book were plucked, taken out of the text, and used as evidence in the courtroom. That madness went on for about more than a year, as a result of which my Turkish lawyer had to defend my Armenian fictional characters in the courtroom. And after that year, we were all acquitted, me and the fictional characters. So the reason I'm saying this is because it's, when you don't have freedom of speech, things can get very absurd, and anything you say might offend the authorities. People understand that it's difficult to talk about political history in Turkey, but people sometimes might not realize that it's equally challenging to write about sexuality or to question gender codes, or issues like incest, child brides, child marriages, domestic violence, femicides. So these issues can also offend authorities in Turkey.
It's amazing that you, of course, talk to history and her story. We've talked about nationalism, and I'd love to turn to feminism next. That statistic, I think, about child brides from Girls Not Brides, 15% of child marriages happening in Turkey. But on a positive note, there's also so much extraordinary advancement in the world. I think about Gabrielle Chanel as a bibliophile, being a promoter and friend and creative partner of the avant-garde artists and authors of her era. I think of Virginie Viard, progressing so much of that discussion in the work in our foundation in terms of empowering the most vulnerable women and girls. What does feminism mean to you today, and how would you like to see that movement advance?
Yeah, I'm so happy that we're talking about this. It's so close to my heart. I think, feminism is such a crucial conversation we should be having at this moment in time, particularly because we're at a crossroads. And I'm saying this because I never forget, not that long ago, when I used to live in Istanbul, an American scholar said to me that it was very understandable for me to be a feminist because, after all, I lived in Turkey. And I've never forgotten that, because she said this with all good intentions, but the way she said it, as if you don't need feminism in America, you don't need feminism in Canada, because they're so beyond that threshold. And where we are right now, fast forward, I think what we've seen over and over is that there's no such thing as solid lands versus liquid lands. We're all living through liquid times. And even the rights that we enjoy as women, as minorities, can be taken away. We have to be more engaged citizens. We have to be in this public debate. I find it very important that there are more women involved in public conversations, decision-making, in every aspect of life. So my definition of feminism is one that does not retreat into any tribe, any box, but opens up conversations. I want the kind of women's movement that's intersectional, that is very much aware also of all kinds of inequalities, especially with regards to class, race, regional divisions, digital divisions. We need to have these conversations. A feminist is someone who cares about inequality, who wants diversity, who appreciates diversity and inclusion and equality. I want the kind of feminist movement that goes hand in hand with LGBTQ+ movement and understands that we are in this together, but also the kind of feminist movement that enters into conversations with men, because coming from a patriarchal country, what I have seen is, of course, patriarchy makes women unhappy, but men are unhappy under patriarchy as well, especially young men, especially if you don't conform to given descriptions of masculinity. Your life is going to be very difficult. Because sometimes people imagine this is a zero-sum game, and if you give women rights, you're taking rights from men away. There's no such thing. This is not a zero-sum game. Patriarchy makes people unhappy. A system based on inequality is not good for anyone. So let's open up these conversations about masculinity, equality, intersectionality. That's the kind of feminism that I find very crucial at this moment in time.
It's so admirable how, of course, you have so many voices in your writing, but also silence plays such an important role. So when you speak, I think about Layla in 10 minutes and 38 seconds and giving a voice to the silenced. And I've also heard you say that a writer's job is to create an open space where we can talk, try to give a voice to the voiceless, the forgotten, the silenced, the forsaken. That's really searingly evident in your work. I wonder, in all of that work, is there a particular book of yours that you feel has done that most extraordinarily? Can you pick a favorite child in terms of how that has evolved?
That's so hard, you know, honestly, because when I look at my books, to me at least, each and every one of them is so different, because I was a different person when I started writing each. I think books change us, you know, they definitely change their writers. By the time you finish, something has shifted inside you. I'm hoping something shifts inside their readers as well. With every book, you learn. If I have to pick a book, you know, if you push me in that direction, I will always pick the book that I'm yet to write, you know, not any of the ones I have written. But I think minorities have always played an important role in my work, and I am more interested in the periphery rather than the center. I believe literature can rehumanize people who have been dehumanized, because we generalize very easily. You know, we talk about the other in terms of very abstract terms. And numbers don't mean anything. That's the truth. Numbers and numbness, I think there's more than rhythm and rhyme between these two words. It means nothing whether it's 5,000 refugees or 50,000 refugees. The mind doesn't register the difference. But if I know the stories, if I know their names, you know, the plurality of their stories, then that's a different thing. Then emotionally we connect. I'm a big believer in the power of emotions, and I think it's a pity that we underestimate emotions. We see them as a source of weakness, but what we remember, we mostly remember through emotions. There are studies that show when we go to a talk, if the talk is mostly given through numbers and statistics and data, the next day around noon we have forgotten around 62% of the talk. Has evaporated. But if the same facts are given via stories and emotions, we remember. You know, Maya Angelou, of course, she said it so beautifully. She said, people might forget what you've done, what you've written, you know, but they will never forget how you made them feel. So there is a power to feelings, and I think we need to focus on that in order to open up these conversations.
It's beautiful. It makes me think, for those that haven't been, the Imperial War Museum's new Holocaust education galleries are extraordinary in the singular stories that they tell. And it's interesting to hear you talk about the periphery, about your own ritual, which leads me to heavy metal music and the fact that you defy challenging these expectations, and really in the ritual of your work are also so surprising in so many ways. I guess I remember Christo not having eaten until 6 p.m., then having garlic in a big meal. Zaha, before she passed, when we worked together, saying nothing good happens before noon. Is there a ritual to your practice? How is it that you are so prolific and precise in your writing? Can you give us a little bit of insight into your quotidien?
You know, I guess I have a pendulum. I mean, when I finish a novel, I don't immediately start a new novel. I become a more social human being, a more normal human being when a book is over, and I like to listen. I think writers need to be two things. Primarily, we need to be good readers. Just keep reading, researching. I love research. I love knowledge. But I also like to listen to people a lot. I listen to two things: what they're telling me, but also how they're saying what they're saying, with what kind of energy, emotions. So keep listening, being maybe ready to learn from different disciplines until the pendulum swings back and you find yourself in the midst of another novel. I can work day or night. Sometimes when I hear some novelists say, you know, they have a precise schedule, I envy them, but I think many of us don't have a precise schedule. And many of us are juggling, you know, so you write whenever you can. But what I do make sure is that I read every day. You know, if I haven't read during the day, then I read at night. So that is constant in my life. I don't like silence, so I do listen to different subgenres of heavy metal a lot when I'm writing. Usually
we'll
on
need
headphones.
To follow up with a playlist, the Elif Shafak Clifton playlist.
Yeah, I'd love to share, actually. I like more Scandinavian, Viking, heavy metal, you know, like really high
Obviously.
energy. As you do, yeah.
As you do. So you mentioned what you love to read, and I think we'd love to hear what you love to read, what you love to watch. There has been, especially in this pandemic, so much great storytelling coming in on the big screen.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder where that's also something that is interesting to you or on the horizon in terms of the platforms for your narratives.
Absolutely. I have a lot of respect in cinema and theatre. However, I'm not a very big viewer of TV. I don't watch much TV. I'm a very audio person. I don't know why. So I listen to audio, radio programs, podcasts a lot, and completely different shows when I'm walking, when I'm doing something. So it's just, without necessarily watching, but transporting yourself into another zone via words is closer to me. But at the same time, I love when different disciplines of art can collaborate. So literature and cinema, their collaboration has been amazing. Not always worked well, but when it works, it's just fascinating.
It is fascinating, and I'd love to now turn to your fascinating book, The Island of Missing Trees. Of course, it's an incredible story that starts in '74, that takes us from Cyprus to London. And I wonder, the question is, why now? What was the urgency of finding an entry into this story?
Oh, thank you. I have been wanting to write about Cyprus for a very long time, but at the same time I could not dare. So, I've been researching, reading, taking notes, but it's not an easy story to explore. And those of you who've been to the island perhaps would agree with me. This is a beautiful place, beautiful island with beautiful people north and south. But at the same time, it's a place where the wounds are unhealed. There's a lot of grief and clashing memories. So depending on whom you talk to, they will tell you a completely different memory and past. So how do you, as a storyteller, approach a story or a land that has been ravaged by ethnic violence, partition, and division without yourself falling into the trap of tribalism or nationalism? I could never find an angle into this story until I found the fig tree. So I'm very thankful to the fig tree because it gave me a completely different perspective and maybe a bit more courage to approach. As you know, when you go to Cyprus, there's a division line there that literally separates Christians from Muslims and Greek Cypriots from Turkish Cypriots. So it's very much alive, the past, the division. But when you tell the story, at least partly through the perspective of a tree, because I think we have so much to learn from trees. They live longer than us. They're wiser than us. They were here before us. Most probably they're going to be around when we've all disappeared. So trees, the way they connect both under and above the ground, they're much more sentient than we realize. But most importantly, I think what we have lost is a certain sense of connectivity and humility. We tend to think we are the owners of this planet, that we're the center of this world, that we cut down trees, we use them, and then we throw it aside. But from a tree's perspective, actually everything is part of an ecosystem. And when you destroy one part of an ecosystem, actually you're destroying your own life because we're all connected. So it gave me a very different perspective that I needed to write in order to tell the story.
It's fascinating, I guess, as a child of Brezhnev's Russia, I look at the Island of Missing Trees or the Bastard of Istanbul, and I think of that intergenerational pain.
Yeah.
And I wonder, what has the response been? You've just come in from Greece this morning.
Yeah.
How are you finding the response from these different communities?
It's been incredibly moving, and it really means a lot to me because especially the emails or sometimes book reels that I receive from Cypriots on both sides saying, this is the story that I've been wanting or waiting to read for a long time. That is very precious for me. At FT Festival about a month ago, I met 3 young Cypriots, and the third one had mixed parents, like the Ada in the book. And the things they said to me, I don't think I will ever forget. That said, of course, ultranationalists will never be happy, but they will never be happy with, I don't think, my writing anyway. So it's been incredibly moving, the response. I want to say something about this intergenerational memories that you referred to because it's so important in this book. I observe immigrant families or families from any kind of complex background And it's very interesting that the first generation, these are the people who have gone through the biggest hardships, sometimes traumas, and they have a lot to tell, but they don't have a language. So they keep a lot inside. The second generation, they don't want to talk about the past, especially if there has been a migration or displacement. They can't because they have to be forward-looking, they need to build a new life, tabula rasa. So it's the third generation or the fourth generations, the youngest in these families, who are asking the sharpest questions about identity, belonging, their ancestors' memories. And then suddenly you may meet young people carrying old memories. And that to me is very interesting. So in this book, intergenerational memories, but also the possibility of inherited pain is a big issue. Like we talk about how we might have inherited the color of our hair, the shape of our nose or chin from our ancestors, but do we also inherit our sorrows or our own, melancholy, the absences? We talk about family stories, but what about family silences? So I'm also very interested in inherited pain.
It's interesting, I think, of the parallels of art, and in starting to live in China, it was the work of Ai Weiwei that was so politicized, and that, of course, drove so much of the conversation. By the end of my decade there, it was the next generation looking at the city, at South Bay, urbanism, the environment, and so it was very much turning forward, being very future-facing. So it'll be interesting also as we look to the East to think about how that evolves. But you mentioned identity politics, and I'd love to understand, of course, you are writing the Cypriot British narrative as a Turkish woman that will be translated far and wide. I want to know how you feel identity politics are really driving the conversation and maybe some of the silence. Where do you feel that's playing out on the global stage?
Yeah, I think this is an important conversation, and unfortunately this extreme polarization and anger, which I don't think is helping anyone. There is a reason why wherever we've seen an increase in populist authoritarianism across the world, demagogues have been trying to stoke more duality, more polarization, more tension, more anger, more us versus them, because they know they benefit from that, When people start to distrust each other, when opponents become enemies, we might have disagreements, that doesn't mean we are each other's enemies. When political language is replete with, full of martial metaphors, I think we need to be very careful. This is how you lose democracy. We might still have the ballot box, but if we lose democratic norms and institutions, just coexistence, what are the things that unite us? So identity is a big part of this conversation. And I think what is happening right now is we're living in a world that never, ever encourages us to be multiple. I lived in Boston for a while at Mount Holyoke. I was a fellow. It was very cold, and I never forget one full year in the library, mostly studying 1960s, 1970s African-American women's movement. And it changed me, because when you read the works of the women who were leading the movement at the time, there's such a strong emphasis on multiplicity. Like when you read people like Audre Lorde, many of these women, I have to say, being women, they were on the receiving end of sexism. Being women of color, they were on the receiving end of racism. Coming from maybe disadvantaged backgrounds, they knew how inequality worked in terms of class as well. And many of them coming from LGBTQ+ communities, they knew how homophobia worked, for instance. So when they talked about power, they did so in a more nuanced way. When they talk about identity, they did so in a more multiple way. That's something we have lost today. I want to give you an example, if I may. I am an Istanbulite. Of course I'm Turkish. Of course I have very local roots, a sense of attachment. But I also feel I'm very attached to the Balkans. I have elements in my soul from the Middle East. I do consider myself European, the values that I share. I have become a Londoner over the years. I feel attached to this city. I have become a British citizen over the years. And despite what politicians have been telling us throughout this Brexit saga, I want to call myself a citizen of the world. That doesn't mean you're a citizen of nowhere. It doesn't mean you're just floating in the air without a care, It means you do feel connected to multiple places. But then they say, because you traveled, you can be multiple. I disagree. Maybe we were born and bred in the same town. You know, 600 years, ancestors were there. Still, we have multiple belongings. It could be your sexual identity, it could be your political views, it could be who you are. Every human being is so complex. So what identity politics in a narrowest sense does is it doesn't allow us that kind of multiplicity. It's a good starting point, but it cannot be where we end up the journey. We have to broaden that journey.
And that is an optimistic journey because some of the incredible voices you referenced, some of the incredible writers and artists and musicians that were long forgotten are now finding more of a space in terms of the polyphony of our times. And I think about the Penn lecture that H.G. Wells, that you so brilliantly delivered. And I wonder what the futurist H.G. Wells would think of these post-pandemic times.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, his work is so relevant. And also the prophecies, in a way, his futuristic prophecies, in his writing, so many things that he foresaw happened. But to be honest, I think if he were alive today, he would be quite depressed. And H.G. Wells, of course, in addition to being a great fiction writer and having an amazing imagination, was also someone who cared about human rights. So his support for English Pan was important. We have entered an age, in my opinion, perhaps you might disagree with me, but there are core issues on which we cannot be silent. So human rights, minority rights, rule of law, separation of powers, we might have disagreements, but these are all core things that we all need. And coming from a country like Turkey, you know, from a wounded democracy, I don't think as a storyteller I have the luxury of being apolitical. I can't say, I only want to talk about my fiction, you know, I don't want to talk about human rights. We have to. Also, of course, being a feminist, one of the many wonderful things that I've learned from feminist movements of past generations is politics is not only what Boris Johnson said today, what happened in the parliament yesterday, it's more than that, right? So the personal is also political. So again, you might be writing about sexuality, that too could be political. All I'm trying to say is there are certain issues starting with human rights, and I think H.G. Wells was very much aware of this, on which we have to speak up and speak out.
Well, before we turn to Q&A, I would love to hear you speak out and give some top tips on how to stay sane in this age of division. Of course, that was the Pocket Manifesto that emerged in August, and we'd love to leave this audience before the Q&A with some of those highlights from that work.
I think what I've realized, you know, writing that little booklet helped me to realize that it is actually okay not to be okay at a moment like this. And we're putting too much pressure on ourselves because we think we have to be successful and we have to be cheerful, we have to be on top of our game, because how come everyone else is doing it so well? You know, why am I failing? Actually, no one is doing it so well. There are people who maybe hide their own anxieties better than others, but it's a moment of angst. There is an existential angst. Every study shows, especially young people, it's not easy to be young in an age like this. It is the age of anger, it's the age of anxiety, but also fear, distrust, uncertainty. So rather than pretending that these feelings are not around us, how do we, first of all, recognize their existence, all these negative emotions, but try to turn them into something more positive? And then to read helps. When you read people like Toni Morrison, you know, she used to say, I get angry, and rightly so, I understand her anger, but then I go and sit down and write. So it's not being angry or anxious. What do we do with our anxiety? What do we do with our fear or anger? Can we turn it into something positive, both for ourselves, but also for our communities? That's where we are, I think. And that might help us, maybe not to be more sane, but a little bit more hopeful. If I may add this, you know, I'm not a very optimistic person. I'm Turkish, you know, it's not in my DNA. I think if you open a map of Europe, if you chase the river Danube with your finger as you move eastward, the level of optimism drops. So by the time you reach Bulgaria, Romania, Black Sea, Turkey, we're not very optimistic people. But what I am trying to say is I have a positive view on pessimism. And it's okay for the mind to be a bit more pessimistic if we can keep our hearts a bit more optimistic, if we can have a bit more hope. And that hope, I believe, is going to come from our fellow human beings. So that's why we need these spaces are so precious. Cultural festivals where we can slow down, have nuanced conversations, less judgment, less anger, and hear each other's voices. We need these spaces. I honestly think cultural festivals are among our last remaining democratic spaces.
It's such a beautiful place to pause, and Toni Morrison also said this is precisely when artists get to work.
Yeah.
Karl Lagerfeld also said that books are a hardbound drug without any danger of an overdose, so I'd love to turn it over to our happy addicts for some questions for Elif Shafak this morning. Natalie Livingston.
Well, thank you for an amazing talk. That was absolutely enlightening. This might be a silly question. I'm fascinated by the theme of intergenerational pain that you raise in your book. And that's something that is very much a Jewish experience as well. What do you think the antidote to that intergenerational pain is, and what kind of balms would you suggest that will soothe that kind of pain?
Yeah. So I appreciate it. It's a beautiful question. And I think it's happening in so many families, doesn't it? There are so many absences, silences that we find difficult to talk about. But it's a mistake to think that by not talking about them, we're not passing on anything to the next generation. You feel sometimes, you sense the presence of absences. It affects us, even the stories that we're not aware of. So to be able to talk, in my opinion, is healthier. But stories help, sharing the stories, even if they are painful, to be able to talk about them calmly, to have open spaces where we honor people's experiences, including their traumas. Of course, ultimately, we need a dose of forgetting as well. But in order to be able to forget, we have to remember first. Because if you tell survivors of genocide or Holocaust, forget, that's like adding insult to injury, Remembering is a responsibility. Memory is a responsibility. We cannot repair what we haven't remembered, right? And what we haven't repaired, we're bound to repeat, in my opinion. So in order to be able to move on, we have to remember. If I may add this very quickly, this is very relevant in this book because in Cyprus there's a bi-communal organization, as you know, who are literally digging the ground in order to find the bones of people who went missing during the Troubles. And to me, it's incredibly moving because Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots are working together. Many of them are women, many of them are volunteers and young people. And the reason why they're digging the past is not to go back to old animosities, but to give the dead dignity and the families a possibility for closure, a possibility for healing so that they can build a better future together. So all I'm saying is stories matter, memory matters. Hopefully one day we will be able to let go a little bit, but at this moment in time we have a responsibility to remember and share the stories.
Thank you, Elif. Hannah.
Thank you both so much for this fascinating conversation. Elif, you spoke about women supporting women, especially in the context of your own personal story. And then you mentioned how important it is to bring men on board. Yeah. Do you have any concrete suggestions for how one might do that?
Yes. Tough question. And I think what concerns me is when we retreat into our own echo chambers. I am worried that that's a very narcissistic existence. If all my friends think like me, speak like me, vote like me, it means I'm surrounded by my own mirror image. And that's a very self-centered existence, isn't it? We don't learn anything from echoes. I come from a country that has never, ever appreciated diversity. And I think by losing that, we have lost a lot. I'm not only talking about financial loss, political loss, something in our conscience, as human beings. So to appreciate diversity, including diversity of opinions, I might be very critical, and I think we need to be very critical of any ideology that sees, any group of human beings above others. At the same time, try to understand why people might be voting differently, thinking differently. I'm very critical of Brexit, but that doesn't give me the right to look down upon people, anyone who voted Brexit. As a storyteller, I try to understand Why did people vote in this way that I haven't voted? So those conversations are very important. And again, we need cultural festivals, we need art and literature, investing in the arts, because these are the spaces where people from completely different backgrounds can read the same book, can come to the same concert, can watch the same movie. And we need that. Just keeping the doors open. Also being aware of our language. You know, words matter. Rather than using words based on exclusion, how to be more inclusive in our language is important. So, of course, my primary emphasis is on women's rights, is on minority rights. But I don't think that's a zero-sum game. And I do know that the codes of masculinity make many, many men unhappy and feel like trapped. So if we can have conversations about this, and this is the right moment to do this because we are seeing an escalation in violence against women and girls, there's no way we can solve this problem unless we have men on board as well. And there are amazing men's organizations, grants, doing important work. It's not easy because unless men intervene in what's going on, how is anything going to change? So it's to our benefit if we can have more inclusive spaces and change our language and narrative, change the narrative. Thank you.
Hi. So what do you think are like the biggest problems within like the feminist movement today, and especially if we do want to help like create this kind of like intersectional feminist kind of like society and like the whole aims of intersectional feminism, and like how can we essentially implement that within a number of institutions, and so we can like prevent the oppression that these intersectional groups face?
Thank you so
We
much.
might need another hour for this. It's so
Yes.
important as a question.
Such an important question. There are glass walls within feminist movement as well. You don't realize those walls are there until we bump into them, right? Until we run into them. So what are the gaps that keep us apart, whether in terms of race, in terms of regional division, in terms of our own cultural prejudices? There are lots of conversations. To me, inequality is not just one thread. There are multiple layers of inequality, and that's why it's important to have a more intersectional perspective. But if I may be perfectly honest, I'm very sad that today we are wasting our time attacking each other, and there are huge divisions within both feminist movement and LGBTQ+ movement. And the way it's formulated is as if you can either defend women's rights or LGBTQ+ rights. Either you're here or there. I think you can defend both at the same time. So these divisions are not going to benefit any of us. When we waste our time attacking each other, the only thing that benefits from it is patriarchy itself. We might have disagreements, there might be issues on, you might think differently than me, but the core is there, and the core is good for everyone. That's what we're losing. And I'm sorry, but this is happening in the UK. It's not happening in Turkey. It's not happening in Brazil. It's not happening in those countries where there's so much violence against both women and sexual minorities that you don't have the luxury to get divided like this. Why are we doing this? So I think we need to go beyond these conversations. It just breaks my heart that we've become so divided at a moment when we needed solidarity the most.
Thank you for that brilliant insight. Where do we go? Maybe someone in the back? Otherwise, maybe someone in the front.
Thank you. You've spoke about the value and importance of arts, culture, literature in addressing some of the challenges of today, but often these spaces are spaces of great privilege. How do we deconstruct that, and how do we broaden out the conversation?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Especially with regards to these spaces, yeah? In a moment of pandemic, unfortunately, politicians particularly tend to think that arts and culture is a luxury that can be discarded. It's not essential. And that's so dangerous, and it has political consequences. It has social consequences. Sometimes music is the only way a child from a disadvantaged background can, access another world and can go beyond the limits that he or she might have found. So if you cut that off, if you close down libraries, it has political consequences. Then you're creating a society which is much more divided, and there's much more anger, and you're creating ghettos. Ghettos are horrible, right? We need interaction. We need to learn from each other. That's why we love London so much. I know to some people it's like a cliche. Coming from Turkey, it is not. I honestly think the diversity in London should be treasured. I'm not taking it for granted. So I'm worried that at a moment like this, not many politicians in power, unfortunately, understand the importance of culture. And we have to invest in this. Also, how do we empower the disempowered? We need to have very genuine conversations about inequality. We are at this moment in time when inequality is not a footnote. It has to be at the center. If so many children in this country do not even have access to laptops at a moment when you're having online education, how is that going to work out? So the gaps are widening, and we all need to be worried about this. I do care about regional differences, as well as digital differences, gaps. So invest in culture, but empower the disempowered and bring them on board. Have them at the decision-making, the tables where the decisions are being made. I think it's very important.
I think that requires some applause before we even end. It was so powerful. I think we have time for one more question, following on from that beautiful point about transcending ghettos through the art of storytelling. There is one there. Speak now or forever.
There's a lady.
Hold your peace.
Hello.
Hi.
I was really interested in what you were saying about immigration and language, and how for immigrants, language can be a bit of a barrier. And I am a first-generation immigrant, and I think it is really hard, as you said, to speak to my parents because there's so much trauma around the experience of immigration.
Yeah.
But I think that my parents and my family have such an important story to tell, and I'm not sure how to communicate that because of that language barrier that you were talking about, because I think that their experience can be treasured, but I don't know how to communicate it with them because we both speak such different languages, me and my parents.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's a beautiful, beautiful question. I hear you. Sometimes, as if we're speaking different languages, right? I think we need to keep trying, create an environment in which they can feel that their stories are honored, validated is important, but also to connect with oral culture, oral storytelling, because not everything is found in written culture. The reason why I'm saying this, again, maybe goes back to my grandmother. Her house was, full of superstitions, irrationality, stories. And then I realized it too late, that food for her was a language. This was a woman who had so much to say, but she didn't know how to say it, so instead she would feed you. There are women like that. So they create these amazing tables. Food is their language. Or these folk tales. They are telling you something, but telling it in a very indirect way, in a very roundabout way. Does it make sense? So that's also a language. And if we can maybe pay more attention to whatever we call that field, oral culture, superstitions, legends, folk tales, things that have been unfortunately so many times looked down upon by written culture, we need to understand the importance of that world as well. And many people, especially coming, our parts of the world, my part of the world, for women especially, that is the field where and how they transmit memory from one generation to the next generation. So I want to honor oral culture, but also have more an open space where they feel at least secure and safe. And I think they will share those stories when they feel the time is right.
If I may take the liberty of the last question, following on from that question from a young thinker, and it's the Proustian one of words of advice. What words of advice would you give to a young writer?
Oh, it's tough. I think writing never gets easier. It really doesn't get easier, whether it's your first book, 5th book, 10th book.
12th book, 19th book.
And we tend to think writing is like adding one brick upon another brick every day, but sometimes it's about letting go, you know, it's about destroying, which is the hardest bit. I started with the negative things, but the beautiful thing about writing is if you really love the art of storytelling, if you really feel it in your heart, go for it. And do not worry about what other people will say. You know, I'll just add this very quickly. I used to give talks at different schools in Turkey. And it gave me a chance to observe young people. If you speak to a 7-year-old, 8-year-old Turkish, Jordanian, Egyptian child, no different than a French, Irish, or American child. Same confidence. At that age, girls are even more confident than boys. They have so much chutzpah. If you ask in a room full of children, is there anyone here who would like to become a poet someday or a novelist? So many hands go up. But then I would go and speak to high school students who have been through puberty, and everything has changed. You know, now girls don't want to talk. Now if you ask in a room full of young people, is there anyone who would like to become a poet? No one puts their hand up. Nobody wants to become a novelist. Why? Because we as a society have taught them to just blend in, don't stand out, people will judge you, you know, what you wear, the length of your skirt, what you say, the tone of your laughter. So that pressure, and we let go of our own creativity. All I'm going to say is, please nurture your inner garden. You know, nurture your own creativity. Take care of it, and don't let anyone pull you down.
Thank you, Elif. I think your character Layla says in her book that the 2 most important principles for remaining unscathed in life are to know when to arrive and when to leave.
And when to leave.
And when to leave.
And
so here we leave you to this brilliant festival. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.